Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to rape as a crime that we are today looking at in this debate, we believe that at the time at which we are debating, the very fact of a commission of a rape itself has a strong societal chilling effect that we see around today, right? We believe that it's almost become the nucleus of all narratives on the idea of gender discourse and disparity. We tell you that currently any occurrence of the crime of rape itself generates a huge amount of repulsive and abhorrent reaction from society in terms of it defining the most prominently the kind of gender roles that society perceives that women have today in terms of the power subjugation and in terms of the place in the power structure in society today. We tell you more importantly that currently all forms of deterrence in terms of rigorous imprisonment and other forms of sentencing have continued to fail. We have seen no improvement in statistics in terms of declining rates of the commission of this crime in the past few years. We tell you that it's only in fact increased in most cases and it's only received more media attention, leading to more worsening of the situation in terms of the way gender disparity is looked at today in society. There's a huge movement today to undo all of this and to make sure that there is any move possible for the law or for sentencing standards to improvise the social status of women and at the same time improve the social discourse itself in terms of symbolizing a strong move by the state to solve this problem. We tell you therefore that you need to keep in mind the unique context in which we are debating this, right? We believe that we are going to castrate any rapist that fulfills the most serious category of rape. Courts, for instance, have the most highest bracket of punishment in terms of giving them rigorous imprisonment for the longest number of years, or for that matter, even charges for murder. We tell you cases where it leads to vegetative state for the women or leads to their death. These are certain instances of very serious rape. We tell you that the court is in position to determine this, and that's the standard we're willing to follow. Why do we think that castration is a valid punishment to give? Firstly, let's understand that rape itself is an irreversible crime. The idea of sexual self-determination of a woman is extremely basic to her personality. More importantly, the moment she gets violated in an instance of rape, she permanently loses her independence with regard to these things in two respects. First, she's psychologically traumatized in a way that she cannot reverse this harm. She's continuously worried about the relationships she has. She tries to conceal the fact along with the family that she cannot carry on normal relationships with people. Her marriage prospects are harmed. Her basic ability to talk to people in society is harmed because there's a huge patriarchal setup that we must embrace today that does exist as an externality for these women to exercise their ability to actualize themselves perfectly. Once they've been raped, the trauma itself prevents them from exercising certain other basic rights. We tell you more importantly, it also forces a chilling effect on women at large when they believe that due to the increasing rates of commission of this crime, women cannot step out of their houses after a particular time in the night, or for that matter because deterrence hasn't worked and the enforcement mechanism isn't perfectly absolute, that the only way in which they can prevent rape, and because the sentencing has already failed, they have no hope but to overly protect themselves, and this causes a huge amount of problem in terms of how women perceive their ability to independently behave in society, right? So therefore we must recognize that the violation of the kind of sexual self-determination independence a woman has is irreversible, and therefore we believe that the kind of sanction we must place should also be equally proportional. Which brings us to proportionality. Before that,
tell us how castrating the rapist helps a woman communicate better with the patriarchal society or overcome her trauma.
Okay, we don't believe that the only effect we need to expect out of a sanction like this is for women to think differently or men to think differently. We believe that often sentencing theories or laws themselves, by ways of legal sanction, have initiated a change in social mindsets. For instance, the mere increase of something like a sanction or the number of years or in prison, or in this instance castration itself, forces men to at least reconsider their ability or their urge to commit rape in the first place. We tell you nothing else, it reduces the number of rapes that takes place, and that itself leads to a better outcome when the statistics show that people are not committing rape at all as they used to. But more importantly, it also symbolizes that something is being done to prevent women from being harmed in a way that cannot be avoided, right? Women themselves will feel more confident about stepping out of their houses knowing that if men really want to rape them, they have to think twice as much before they go ahead and do so. We think these are sufficient benefits to run this debate on. So let's understand the three prongs of proportionality. Because obviously man will come up and rant about how there are three equally valid ways of like objectives of sentencing in terms of rehabilitation that he's going to run throughout this debate, and in terms of proportionality and in terms of retribution. We tend to look at some cases like this where the underlying tone of the discourse is heavily ingrained with something like women disparity. We tell you that sentences or the retributive aspect of sentencing can take a precedence over the other. How do we see this? Firstly, the purpose of sentencing is not purely rehabilitation alone. It also often plays a key role in initiating social change. For instance, rape itself can be recognized as a separate crime. When society came across instances of domestic violence, they recognized it as a separate crime and they didn't club it with normal broader crimes, for instance, assault or battery and things like that. Similarly, when issues of untouchability came about, or for that matter, dowry and Sati-related deaths, the state recognized these crimes as distinct crimes which deserve distinct treatment. We tell you also, moreover, not all crimes always require rehabilitation. When you have a progressive when you have visible failure of deterrence progressively. For instance, the fact that terrorists don't stop killing other people or bombing towns and cities just because they are harmed to death. Often, sentencing evolves progressively to have harsher sentences that in fact work against these people with a high level of deterrence. We tell you that therefore sentencing itself is a very important concept that must take into account changing social circumstances or more aggravated cases of disparity against women. So in this case, we tell you that there is a far less window for people to commit rape for two reasons. One, if you look at the example of terrorists, people propose not death sentences but keeping them behind bars for their whole life without parole because they believe that the sanction is directly aligned with the objective of the terrorists, that is to continue to either create an apprehension of a lack of peace or for that matter go out and commit these acts again. We tell you that we're not discarding with the need for rehabilitation. We're not discarding with the need for campaigns and education to try and change the mindset of people in the long term. We're going to take all other measures that have to exist side by side in order to make sure that in the long term, instances of rape come down for the reason that it should. In terms of say rape being caused due to past adjudication. All of these issues are independent issues that can be solved in various ways. We're not ready to tackle all of them. We think that the mere increase of sentencing or making it really harsh, like castrating them, is going to substantially reduce instances of rape in the first place. The very fact that a man wants to commit rape is obviously also under the impression that he is going to perpetrate this crime later. And mere case of rehabilitation or life sentences or things like putting him behind bars or restraining orders are insufficient to do two things. Firstly, to prevent the person from committing rape in the future, because we believe that the very act of penetration symbolizes the most abhorrent form of rape. We also tell you that it also doesn't work in terms of the apprehension that people will have the children of rape. For these reasons, we get to propose.
Mr. Speaker, you can cut a man's balls, but what you can't do is you can't stop rape until you cure him of his desire for domination. And that's what we're going to run our case on. We're going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that firstly, telling us that rape is special and rape needs to be punished more than anything else or different from everything else is firstly a wrong idea to base it on. Secondly, to give the highest of sentences to only a few people who are committing the most heinous kinds of rape is mere tokenism that gives a false sense of security to those women as Sounak would like you to believe. It doesn't create any sort of deterrence. We are further going to tell you that it's extremely ineffective because it doesn't cure the sex drive. All you're doing is telling a man that he can't penetrate a woman or dominate a woman by using his cock, and that's all you're doing. We're saying it's extremely ineffective because it doesn't take away the idea of domination. It doesn't cure the rape culture. As much as Sounak would have you believe there is a separate problem, we tell you no, your move is grounded in this problem itself. Your moves match of the same kind of logic that tells you that women need to be protected more and need to be dominated. So what am I going to talk about first? Firstly, rebuttal. So you say that the basis for targeting rape is because rape has a chilling effect, and castrating only rapists which is committed the most heinous of crimes is going to create some amount of deterrence. We say no, that's not true. It's not true because it's a logic that says because you've done something to our women, and because our women are so special, and because they need to be protected so much more, we're going to make sure that you get the highest possible amount of punishment. That tells you, Mr. Speaker, that it's okay, and that furthers the idea that it's okay that women are the weakest sex which we have, and therefore they need higher forms of punishment or higher forms of protection. We think that's particularly problematic. We think that's problematic because it further symbolizes the weakness that you're talking about when it comes to gender roles. No, we say further, why is it that this move is extremely tokenistic? It's tokenistic because every time rapes happen, rapes are prevalent. That's because of the essential problem of you not being able to implement or catch enough rapists. You take that one case, we have found that one rapist and make a mockery out of it and say that we're going to give him the most amount of punishment and this is going to solve the problem of rape. Just like the Justice Committee, we're going to bring about new changes in laws and we're going to do like big things to these few people and because that's going to create rape. Because Sounak would have you believe that doing this will give the women a less of a chilling effect, a sense of belonging, and she would be stepping out of the home. And that's the false assurance that you're giving her because you're not curing the problem at ground and don't let them separate issues. Then, Mr. Speaker, it's not that we should not target her specifically or do these things because it's simply heinous and inhuman. We say, Mr. Speaker, that rape must not be separated. But even if it is separated, we say that you as a state should not be targeted. We say as a state, you should not be as inhuman or as heinous as the person who is committing the crime itself. The rationale for this, Mr. Speaker, is because we think that there are certain basic things like dignity of a person, or maybe the right to life, or the right to procreate, that a state should not take away under any and all circumstances. We say this legal justice system does not transact on shame. It doesn't say that we need to do things like shaming and shaming because we think that's the way we want to treat our victims. That's the way we want to treat anybody who's convicted in our state. We say the state must be held up to a higher standard of responsibility. The reason the state and not terrorists sign things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the reason that the state bans torture, not the other party, the reason that the state does not do things to those people who are committing crimes as they might do to the victims, is because we don't think that the state should be as inhuman as the people it's trying to punish. We think that it's bad, it's an extremely bad message in terms of symbolism to send out when the state says we are going to be as bad to you because we are like you. We think that's particularly problematic.
So, but you do recognize that if I lock you up in a room, the kind of and I don't give you any food or water, the kind of punishment I receive is being locked in a room but being given food and water. We're going to humanely give them chemical castration. We're not going to like take some sort of weird rod and shove it up.
If that's true, then it just goes against what Sounak talked about decades. If you want to be humane in this, then you can't run it to say that we're going to do these things so that people are going to be scared of raping people. So don't tell us that we're going to be humane and scare people at the same time. We don't think that's what you want to do. Then moving on to why we think it's ineffective. We think it's ineffective because it doesn't cure a person of his idea or his desire to dominate. It doesn't do so because the idea of rape is not about me wanting to penetrate somebody physically. The idea of rape is the idea to dominate women. And that idea comes out of a culture that tells me it's okay to dominate women, a culture that tells me women need to be protected, or a culture that tells me women are the weakest sex. Now the idea of domination is not being cured later, Sounak. The idea of domination is not being cured by simply me telling you that I'm going to take away your sex drive. This idea of domination is the basis for why more and more rapes are happening in India. And unless and until you cure that, you cannot cure the problem of rape. We say, Mr. Speaker, that this rape culture is essential to be cured in the instant case. Something, unless you do that, your measures are extremely going to be technical, extremely ineffective. Yes, Sounak.
If I'm a serial killer and if I kill people because I hate the color of their skin, does the state have to first force me to respect this race before charging me with murder?
No, the state doesn't have to do that. But I'm saying if you're a serial killer who likes to chop off people into little pieces, the state should not do that and hang you up. We say that's particularly problematic, as I said, because the state should not portray itself as bad as the criminals. When the state does that, it loses its moral legitimacy to hold these guys to justice. It loses the shield of things like basic rights and basic dignities. All the things that we talk about fundamental rights, all the rhetoric that often comes out of the state that talks about how we must respect people, how we must honor people, how we must be like non-violent to an extent, or also be measured in our violence. All of those proportionality kind of measures, all of this is completely against the logic that they're using, which is saying let's be as bad as the criminals. We don't think that should be done. We say furthermore, Mr. Speaker, they get to give us a distinction as to why they should only consider rape. We say, are you then okay with cutting the hands of anybody who commits theft? Are you okay with like giving people who've committed like grievous assault or something to confine them to a wheelchair and break their legs forever? Are you okay with all of these things? Are you okay for capital punishment for all kinds of murders? Because the idea is this: if you're going to tell us that the state needs to be as bad as those people committing the crimes, then you also need to tell us why it is that you're singling out only this kind of crime. And telling us that it causes trauma is not mutually exclusive. So Mr. Speaker, essentially what we are doing, we're saying that firstly, that the cause of rape is not that because there is a lack of veterans or because that we don't punish our rapists enough. The cause of rape are different. We say that this punishment that you're giving is extremely tokenistic and gives people a false sense of assurance. We're also telling you that it's extremely ineffective because it doesn't again solve the rape culture. And we say that the legal justice system should be a little more than just being an eye for an eye. Thank you.
We have the opposition to speech, and for now I did write.
Mr. Speaker, the answer to the first part of Nanda's speech, I think spent so much time telling you what simply this. That's called mutual exclusivity. None of our rules are mutually exclusive for fighting domination over women. It's not exclusive for publishing newspaper reports like bad man and of having the capacity to rape. We think that the only thing that can effectively do this is in fact emasculation, something only our move can achieve. Because what our sanction does is something very significant. It tells you that the moment you rape a woman, you can't be a real man anymore. All those things that you thought were the privilege of being a man and are associated with your strength and your virility, etc., the exalted idea of being a playboy, all of these things will be taken away from you because we will castrate you and your ability to participate in the sexual sphere is something that we will restrict. We think that this is the adequate punishment for rape and this is the appropriate punishment for rape because this is in fact the patriarchal idea on which rape is based, and unless we take this away from the man, we really can't take anything else. So let me complete this argument by telling you how this is going to be effective. We're talking about the symbolism of sanction. We see that in some cases, sanctions can actually actively alter mindsets and the way people view rape. We say that they have to prove in their case that it is not necessarily mean that people who only view women as objects to be cherished and protected. We think they're going to do this anyway, regardless of whether this move comes about or not. But given the strong symbolism that this move sets, you're going to say that rape is not just like any other crime. Rape is different. And Mainak, don't trivialize it by telling us that they're going to cut people's legs off or, I don't know, doing something or cut someone's hands off for test. We think that the kind of trauma that you undergo when you lose your wallet and the kind of trauma you undergo when you rape is substantially different, and let's not equate the two. But what we are trying to tell you is this: that when society decides to place a different value on this kind of symbolism, a different value on this kind of crime, that sanctions that will alter the mindset of society and make them view things differently. And that this symbolism will be associated with the kind of sanction that the state places on it. We see this with examples like dowry. Essentially a private transaction between two parties that has now been elevated to the level of taboo merely by imposing a sanction on it. We see something like drugs, right? An instance of self-harm that's been now viewed as a very serious crime simply because the NDPS Act chooses to treat it like that. We see that sanction in itself has a significant effect on how society treats things, and this is not something that we can ignore in the course of this debate. So now, having dealt with the idea that rape is significant and that sanctions are important to how we perceive and cover it, let's move on to some quick rebuttals for what Mainak told. The first thing that Mainak told you is that there's a contradiction in our case because you can't be showcased by hitting somebody. Now, unfortunately in life, you can also strike a balance between competing values. That's exactly what we choose to do. We say that many systems choose to give the death penalty because they think it's adequate death penalty. That does not mean that you're going to hunt this person down with lions on the street. And in all other cases, you are in this merge of hypocrisy and contradiction you can never get out of it. Yes, you have to imprison some person sometime. Take his basic rights away in order to impose that will. This doesn't mean you have to keep him in a dingy, dark cell with a little hole on top and feed him like food and water through that hole every day. We think that this is I don't know, tokenistic contradiction that does not impact us. That brings me to a second rebuttal. That this is in fact a tokenistic move and is not very significant. We think that's not true. We contextualize this crime very well, and we told you the context in which we are imposing it. We told you three things that are very significant. First, that ordinary punishment like imprisonment or something that is failing and is simply not enough, which means at this point it's necessary for us to increase punishment, and therefore nothing towards this is going to be tokenistic. Second, we told you that the idea of rape is so inherently tied to the idea of masculinity, and because this crime strikes at the heart of that very feeling, what this is going to do is achieve substantially more than this. A man is probably not going to be that scared of going to jail for 2 years as he's going to be of not being able to have sex with his life, and therefore that is more evidence, and that is something that we cannot ignore over the course of this debate. This move is certainly not tokenistic in that sense. The third answer to that we already gave is in terms of mutual exclusivity. When we told you that we can do all of those other things like put street lights on the street, etc., which is going to stop rape anyway, and having this one extra move, which is probably the only move that can deal with the question of justice, is not going to leave this move as a tokenistic move in any case. Yeah.
Even in patriarchal societies, can you tell us why the idea of life imprisonment does not exactly serve as a deterrent?
Okay, I don't see how that's an important enough question in this debate, on how life imprisonment is not enough for a deterrent. We say that in this case, because of the special nature of the way this interacts with the crime, and given other slew of measures we're going to be imposing along with it, this is going to be sufficient deterrent. But this brings me to the final idea that they talked about before this house, that this is in fact something that takes away the basic right of a person, something that society never has done. We think that given different points of time, given that combating crimes is in fact such a dynamic thing that we're forced to do, given that proportionality is itself societally determined, we think that we can place different values on life at different points of time, and that is something that people cannot take away from us through the mere use of it.
Mr. Speaker, the first thing that we tell you from side opposition is that theirs is an idea that is going to hurt the interests of women. We tell you that their case has been premised on an idea that is intrinsically harmful to how relations between men and women actually play out in society. What's the first thing we heard from them, right? They came and told us that currently the norms in society of sexuality and gender relations are defined by this idea of rape. They told us that because of this there is some sort of a need for special treatment of this crime, which is why they think social norms of skewed gender relationships can be addressed. We think instead that there are a lot of other underlying reasons as to why the gender norms are currently skewed in the way they are. No doubt they have come and said that they are not mutually exclusive, right? That we can indeed go after educational and other measures. But we tell you that the focus that's going to come about as a result of their system is this idea that if you go and somehow prevent and permanently disable a man from ever raping again, which by the way is not true, he can still commit sexual violence as we come to. Their idea is that if you do that, the relationship between men and women are now going to get moderated. We think that that's untrue. We think that this relationship is based on dynamics of power play, which are not being accurately addressed by them. Because men told you that even if you take away the ability to procreate or ability to actually commit rape in the conventional form, these are people who are still going to be influenced by the ideas of hatred and by the ideas of domination that we have already identified for you, right? If anything, the fact that you've taken away the ability but not the motivation and the desire means that it's very likely that these are people who are going to end up engaging in even more violent methods of violence against women, right? We see in the example of acid attacks against women that lovers who have been spurned or churned, or in other words, have not had their psychotic tendencies being given an ability to manifest itself, have engaged in attacks like acid attacks, right? We think that there is a great danger involved of actually worsening the situation for women. We think the wrong message is being sent by them. The second thing I'm going to talk to you about is the idea of humaneness and inhumaneness, right? I'm going to make this clear for you. At no point have they said that they are okay with the idea of society adopting inhumane punishments, right? If anything, they have come and told you that this is a humane measure. We tell you that that's a simplistic reading. It might be humane in the process in which you mention castration, but we think the end results are no doubt inhumane. Because let's look at exactly what they told us, right? They told us that ours is a society in which the ability, your ability of virility or your ability of sexual prowess or whatever is quite important. We think that in a place like this, in a society like this, when you do take away this ability from a man and then send him out into this society, he is going to be the butt of much ridicule and shame. We think the criminal justice system is indeed going to be one that is transacting in the idea of shame, right? Which is what Ben told you about. We tell you that this is a measure that ends up indeed being inhumane to the people who have been subject to this, right? In fact, if you look at it, the current criminal justice system already allows for the idea of conjugal visits even when you are in prison, right? We tell you that this is itself an acknowledgement that even when you curtail liberty or other comparable things, there are certain things which are considered so essential to your life that it is indeed considered inhumane to take them away, which is why you have practices like conjugal visits even in prison. So we tell you that there is indeed a measure that fails the test of humaneness, and that unless they can come and tell us why society should accept inhumane punishments, their model already falls on that idea, right? Next, we're going to talk to you about the idea of why exactly we think this is a measure that has much harmful results. I'm going to tell you that the fundamental problem, and this is my constructive, is the idea of irrevocableness of this punishment, right? The first, under this I have two headings. The first is the idea and the possibility of wrongful conviction in rape cases. We tell you that we are just like we are opposed to death penalty for the irrevocableness, we are opposed to castration because castration is irrevocable. We tell you that the possibility of wrongful conviction is particularly high in rape cases. Because if you look at the way in which rape trials and rape cases are designed to proceed, we see that these are systems that do not often put in place much safeguards. Of course, we think it's justified that so much emphasis is placed on the testimony of the victim. We think it's important that courts have looked beyond mere procedural ideas to look to convict people. But at the same time, we tell you that this does leave open the room for wrongful convictions to happen. And it's the fact that in the 1990s, right, when DNA technology was first introduced on a large scale in the criminal justice system, we saw that many rapists who had been convicted in the 1970s and 80s in the US turned out to have not committed the crimes after all and were subsequently acquitted. We tell you that the problem of irrevocability that their measure will introduce will make sure that this basic thing that's being taken away from you can never be returned to these people. And we think that because this problem is so particularly important in the idea of rape, this is a move that should not be adopted. The second prong under the idea of irrevocableness is the idea of reformation. Mainak has already told you why it is that the criminal justice system, according to us, should be reformated, right? We think that there are many reasons for this. The most important, obviously, being the idea that reformation, as opposed to mere brutal retribution, is indeed a message of humaneness that we think the state should adopt. But also we think that these are people who do have the potential to contribute to society in future. No doubt they are convicted people and we think they can be punished. But the possibility of reformation is not something that they can prove to be ruled out in these cases. And we think that the humane and the rational approach that the state can adopt in these cases is indeed to show that if at some point of time in the future these people can be reformed, they should have the ability to integrate back into society. That possibility of integration is being nullified by the rule. And we think that's a great problem with it. Yes, go.
Given that the victim is in fact so hesitant to testify and that usually judges adopt a very cautious approach to convicting in rape trials, do you think the opposite is in fact true of the certainty of a verdict?
Even if I accept your contention for certain cases, even if there are some cases where the victim does testify, even if there are some cases where the testimony might be relied on to an overextent by the courts, and we think a wrongful conviction might arise, we think this model is flawed. Because even the possibility that in some cases a man's basic essential nature of life is going to be taken away, we think is grounds to not go for irrevocable punishment, which is the same reason why we are opposed to death penalty also, right? Finally, I'm going to talk to you about this idea that they talked about, right? That sentencing regimes have a role to bring about social change. We don't think that's necessarily true. The essential idea that they put forward is simply that of deterrence. They think that these ideas of higher punishment will change societal outcomes because now people start seeing that these attract higher punishments and are therefore graver crimes. Hence, people will stop doing it. That's essentially what they're doing, right? We don't think that works in practice. If anything, the statistics show that adopting the death penalty for murder cases does not actually help to bring down the rates of murder, right? This is because murder is a crime of passion, and that's something I think we can agree on. Similarly, we tell you, because of the categorization we already gave you, rape is indeed a crime of passion. It is a crime that rests on certain beliefs of domination, that rests on certain psychotic tendencies of the need to exert power over other people. We are saying that rape is not a rational decision that people take before they decide to go out and rape, right? So we tell you that this idea of sentencing regime actually bringing about a change is not really true and will not work. So for all these reasons, we are proud to do this.
It's always good to know that there's a dialogue happening when the dealer happily comes up and says the first thing government is going to talk about and then goes on to make a constructive case because man at the mountain which is drowning is incapable of doing so. So what I'm going to speak about are four things and contextualize this debate properly for you. We're going to talk about what is rape and how it's been understood in this debate. I'm going to talk about how justice is best served. I'll talk about the symbolic value of this movement, why it exists, and finally I'll talk about the end effects. And I will be comparative because that's something that you guys just don't know how to do. So moving on to the idea of rape, and I'm going to work in my remarks into my subtitle. So let's deal with this idea of rape culture, right? Because it's something that's been thrown about a lot. Now when Sounak said that a lot of gender discourse and relations are being defined in the context of rape, that doesn't mean that all feminism and gender differentiation is all about rape all of a sudden. What we mean is by virtue of this crime happening again and again, people are paying attention and it is a big deal to people today. The recognition of the idea that this is an abhorrent act means that society is reacting. There is a dissociation between the kind of punishment this crime is receiving and how people want them to be punished because they recognize that the punishment is not enough, they are not satisfied, and we do recognize that society needs to feel that justice is being done, and that's really important, which is why rape is being singled out specifically in this instance. And about the idea of sexual domination and violence, which is what we've been trying to run it on. We think that of course sex is a crime of domination, but like rape is a form of domination, but it has a sexual angle to it, and that is a form in which domination is perceived in that specific sphere. Now domination of women, when it's done legally or illegally, can happen in a variety of ways, but when it's happening in a sexual context and it comes from the idea of gender being based on the idea that someone has a penis or therefore they are different, that males are therefore more powerful because they have this instrument by which they can violate women, we think that removing that instrument, emasculating them, is a good way of responding to it. And we think therefore there's nothing specific about the idea of the crime itself that it means that you cannot punish them in this way. So we think it's distinct enough, and I think we've gone on to prove that particularly well. Also this idea of something that they haven't really dealt with. We've told you that the social mores in this current frame of mind, we need to be dynamic in terms of responding to it, and that there's a social movement towards something about this, to respond to this in some form or the other. And they've not talked about it at all. They've only talked about the idea of why castration may or may not be good, but they haven't no way gone on to talk about other than like tokenistic things that they've said, like how education is a better idea and all of those, which are not mutually exclusive. haven't done anywhere close to enough. They haven't done anywhere close to enough to show that rapes should not be singled out or treated differently from other crimes, and we've happily fulfilled our burden of those stuff. So let's move on to the idea of what is just. So let's deal in this context. Okay, go ahead.
When you remove the sex angle from rape, but the hatred and domination angle remains and manifests itself in even more violent ways, is that a problem?
Okay, let's get this straight, right? So in a context where there's an individual who's raped someone, alright, what they would have happened is that person goes to jail for an X unspecified number of years, and then comes out and probably hates women and society and all of those things just as much, because nowhere have they gone to show that there's any distinction between the two. We don't think that leads to an immediate response of everyone going around and repeatedly raping people, right? We think in situations where an aggravated form of rape, as we discussed, has happened, when we're talking about a scenario where a grave amount of damage has been done to an individual, we think this is adequate, and we can't stop short because we're worried about the impact it will have on that individual in terms of making them someone who will constantly and perpetually hate society. We must recognize this doesn't happen in other forms of punishment. We must recognize furthermore that in this context you can't not punish people if you have enough reason to do so justly, just because you're worried that they will get pissed off and do something really bad about it or bizarre. We think that's not a particularly good line of argument, and it's very consequential, and I'm ashamed of Nanda for it. The other idea of why only rape has a specific kind of crime, we think this is just to cast a law, definitely not. Right? So when you're talking about the idea of rape and why it is just to do this and that, we must recognize that there's a removal of capacity and a kind of trauma that's given to this woman, especially in the sexual sphere, which we think this is an adequate response in terms of castrating that individual. Because if we attack their entry into their sexual sphere, which is where they have situated this crime, where they have removed someone else's capacity to enter that sphere normally, or to have normal sexual relations beyond that point, we think therefore sexual violence, the idea of hatred and the motivation and the vengeance and all of those things that go into it, this is the best way to respond to that. Yeah.
Alright, so on the one hand, we're saying that people want rapists to be punished, they're punished severely, and that there's a public demand for it. On the other hand, we're saying judges are cautious while they're making rape victims, and then there aren't enough convictions. Can you justify it?
Yeah, it's simple. Like any situation where you have any crime in which you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that that individual ought to be punished, judges are cautious about making sure that there aren't wrongful convictions. That is fine, because that's part of what due process of law involves, and even I know this, right? So in that specific context, you must recognize that there's no particular reason why this punishment should not be given to them, especially not at the altar of stuff like wrong conviction. And the idea and why it is just, even though you're removing such a basic right from them and that's irreversible, let's understand clearly. Even if an individual has life imprisonment for 14 years, that's irreversible. That's 14 years they're not going to get back. The basic right of movement, the basic right of association, the basic right to vote, the basic right to participate in any number of social spheres, the basic right to go and date, and by the way, in most prisons in the world, conjugal visits are not allowed. It just shows they're very American-centric and watch too many TV shows, right? So we clearly see a scenario and a situation in which there's no reason why this specific basic right can't be attacked, other than the fact that they don't seem to want it, because Nanda comes from Delhi and God knows what plans he has for tomorrow. So we must recognize clearly that this is not particularly inhumane. It's a just response to a very horrific crime, and they've not given us any sort of theoretical basis on which to attack that idea. Finally, let's talk about the symbolic value, right? We must recognize that the reason why legal norms and standards exist is because it provides us a framework to judge specific actions, right? So we recognize that if something is delineated as a crime, that is the wrong thing to do. And in that context, we must recognize that the higher the punishment, or the graver it is, or the more it attacks at the root of the crime, these are exactly the kind of ways to show people that this is particularly heinous. It's exactly the way to show people that this is more wrong to do than say a pettier crime of any sort, right? So when we make those distinctions, there needs to be a legal response to a scenario where a crime is becoming more and more of a problem. So when we draw a line in the sand, we recognize that this is something that needs to change, and we're sending out the right message to society that if you do something like this, this is the kind of response we get, and that's why it is deserved. So we think in that context it's perfectly fine. Finally, let's talk quickly about the end effects. We think in terms of retribution versus reformation, we must recognize that there's no reason to believe that the idea of incarceration will be any more reformative or any less reformative than our own. We think the same situation, the same context applies. You can counsel these people while they're being imprisoned as much as you like. You can counsel them while they're being castrated. Like there's no reason specifically to believe that reformation is impeded by virtue of you not having a previous. And we think specifically, and more importantly, an individual can become a working member of society just as valuable. There are lots of important people out there, right? It's not like something you can't live as a human being without. So we don't think particularly they've gone anywhere to show anything. So very proud of it.
We thank the government for its speech, and I invite the opposition to wrap up this
begin by highlighting the, not the shifting stance exactly, but certainly what he considers a slightly more nuanced view of what the first speaker was talking about, right? In terms of Nanda came out and said, look, the reason why they're giving a special priority to the idea of sexual crime of this nature being given a different punishment is because we believe this will facilitate the idea of people paying more attention to this sort of phenomenon. That's a bad reason for punishing crime in the first place. Just because people think that something deserves more attention or something deserves a higher punishment, that should be the only reason to do it. B, reaffirming the point that they've been driving all the way through, treating the idea of sexuality as being the only or the primary reason for dictating the norms between these two sexes only reaffirms the patriarchal notions that this entire side of the house is unfortunately on that piece on, right? That sexual differences are the defining standards between these two sexes in terms of sexual activity, and if you can regularize these, therefore you can achieve equality. That's an idea we fundamentally had a problem with all through the way, and I'll move on to that at one point in first clash, right? The first clash here is the nature of punishment we're talking about. I'll run you through exactly what all three speakers said and why they were all wrong on each count, right? First John, he of course goes on to say that we're equating the idea of taxation with any other high level of punishment. So basically, what we're going to add to is a cumulative level of deterrence. Now, of course, the entire problem with establishing deterrence as the exclusive reason for punishing something, or stating that this is the reason that we're putting a higher punishment in place to make sure people don't do it, is because deterrence itself as the sole reason for punishment is entirely failure. The reason that worldwide the trend of the momentum of trend is against negating death penalty for murder is because murder rates don't differ between countries, but death penalty does or does not exist, right? And this is why, because crimes like murder or like rape are crimes of passion they don't think through logically. Why is this? Because if you were thinking logically, a person who is going to commit rape would sit and think, if I rape this woman, I'll get life imprisonment. Let's go ahead and rape the woman, right? If indeed there was a logical process of thinking, no individual would logically choose life imprisonment because that is a significant enough deterrence. If the act is logical, given that the act of rape, of murder is not logical, they don't think about the consequences. They think particularly instances of sudden violent action, like murder, like rape. There is no logical contemplation of this, which is why the deterrence angle simply will not work. I'll move on now to what Vinodini said under nature punishment, right? So rape reflects, as I said earlier, rape reflects patriarchal constructs, right? It's like the idea of masculinity. Indeed, but it's far broader than what we were talking about in terms of instrumentation, right? It's basically, as Anil said, it's basically tied to the idea of domination. Not just male, but societal and other constructs that tie into the act of rape or violence, etc. So effectively, it ties into a larger social conditioning that individuals have, which is why there are hundreds of Dalit women in particular, other women of course, but particularly Dalit women who are raped across the country every year, because it is a mechanism in which men express dominance, socially, sexually, and otherwise. These are mentalities that are inculcated in this socially, and this is a punishment in this particular case does absolutely nothing to address the underlying cause of that and ensure that those crimes don't occur anymore, or that the individuals who are so newly convicted on this particular process will not do these crimes, right? In fact, none of these goals are addressed by this. So the desire to violate, to control, to ensure the individual is under your thumb just does not go away. And moreover, as I said here, the nature of the crime that he will subsequently commit, right, the more violent nature, will be as bad for the woman. Just because she is no longer being penetrated doesn't mean that the crime she will subsequently be subjected to will be better. Now I'll move on in this particular idea, the ludicrous suggestion that Vinodini made in her meeting, which he said, look, so if someone commits murder, do you recommend that we first teach them not to commit murder and then convict them? No, we don't need that. You convict them, you charge them, but at the stage of sentencing, you choose a punishment which is reasonable and proportionate, and more importantly, achieves the goals that you seek to achieve. Now, where you convict a person of rape, and we're fine with that, but of course, as we believe on our side, you wish to improve the behavior they have outside of prison. Don't choose a particular punishment which won't achieve that goal in the first place. And here's I'll move on to my second clash, the idea of irrevocability and the necessary emphasis that we on our side of the house have placed on this, right? This, as Anil made extremely clear, and I had absolutely no idea why the first two speakers didn't catch up with this, right? Is that the end result of taking away a man's sexuality, just as the end result of taking away a person's life, is what we consider inhumane. So regardless of how you do it, regardless of whether you flay him in public or you take him to a laboratory and inject him, the end result of taking away something as fundamental as a sexual drive is what we refer as inhumane, right? Basically, this is also in particular because they emphasize the idea of rape, but be happy enough to go ahead and use that. And I use Nanda's explicit reasoning as to why this is. This is the idea that they brought about there is the high possibility of wrongful convictions in this particular kind of crime, right? And the reason for this is simple. As Nanda himself said, the new phrase that he used, right? Basically, it shows that society has an increasing desire desire to react, right? Society is not satisfied. Society believes that justice isn't being done. Now, using his own words, given the immense social pressure, he himself said, that act on judges, the vast majority of judges, particularly in this day and age, are warranted to try and acquit an individual who the public itself is convinced is a person who committed rape. And that's the problem, right? Given their own characterization, it is incredibly unlikely that a person the public believes has committed rape will be acquitted, which is why the nature, which is why the possibility of wrongful conviction is extremely high, which is why in the 1990s when profile was finally introduced, many individuals were acquitted of rape because judges acting under previous social pressures had convicted them wrongfully without access to this kind of conviction.
Whenever you have a very high penalty, whether it's death penalty or whether it's something like castration, judges are more cautious about applying the same. But the symbolic value of it remains, and in the context where this is about how to sentence an individual, right? If you know someone's guilty, would you then have a problem with castrating him or not?
Absolutely. This was the second part of my class, the idea of irrevocability. The reason that we have a problem with an irrevocable result of that nature is because, as Anil said, it assumes that the individual who goes into prison simply cannot be cured of that condition. Nanda makes a ridiculous equalization. He says, look, even a certain number of years in prison is irrevocable. He can't get that like that. Indeed, which is why when individuals come out of prison, many of them are able to be reformed and reintegrate into society. Now compare that to a person who's been castrated, right? Who, of course, has been dead publicly and lives in shame for the rest of his life. The idea that we embrace of trying to ensure that individuals are healed of whatever problems they're suffering, whatever problems led them to commit these heinous crimes, that they can therefore become a successful and stable part of society, is completely lost by that idea of punishment. Which is why we say that as a sentencing mechanism, any punishment which removes the slight possibility of definition that exists is a problem. A, on a moral basis for the state, and B, because it's simply not practical to go around doing it every single time, right? So in effect, what we are arguing is that the question is one essentially of degree. So when we are taking away 14 years of life from a person, the degree to which it cannot be reformed from, or the degree to which it is irrevocable, even if we accept that, which we don't, is far smaller than the degree to which getting someone or castrating them is. And that is the issue. We believe there is either a slight possibility of making someone a stable, successful part of society which should embrace that chance and not take the extreme irrevocable measure that they demand. For all these reasons, we are very proud of the course.
Mr. Speaker, the first question in this debate is about the nature of rape, right? And to a large extent, both sides agree. We agree that rape is not only about sex. We agree it is about feelings of domination. It's about wanting to assert your authority over women. And that these are not necessarily things that are motivated only by your sexual drive, which is essentially what they're trying to curb, right? Of course, that logically was something that's been present throughout their case. But this was taken to an even greater extreme, right? We are not doubting at any point of time that there isn't present a sex angle being rape. Obviously, it's present. And when they address this sex angle, sure, you're taking it away. We are telling you that this has worse consequences, right? Which is why we gave you the analysis of why people who have their psychotic, evil tendencies to exert authority over people, when unable to do so, when made impossible for them to carry that out, will react in violent ways. Because these are not people who are thinking in rational terms. These are people who are motivated by certain strong, irrational, passionate desires. We gave you examples of people who attack victims simply because they can't carry out what they want to do with them in the first place, right? To which their response is that jail also builds hatred towards women, therefore we don't think what you're saying is really a problem. A, that's not really addressing our problem in the first place. B, in any case, we tell you that there is a massive difference of degree, right? In jail, what's taken away from you is the idea of liberty. Whereas what's taken away from you when you perform castration on me is the idea of my ability to do a basic human function, the ability to have sexual desires and the ability to procreate. Liberty can be restored. What you're taking away from me during castration cannot be restored. There is a massive degree of difference, and this is where the nature of rape clash falls clearly to us, right? The second question is whether this measure is humane or not. The first thing they said is that this is a humane measure, to which we came and told you while the process may be humane, the end result is not humane. Again, what has been the response, right? They came and said jail is also inhumane. The burden on them is to show you why the idea of castration is a humane process. You are able to come over here and tell why the consequences of castration can also be humane. There hasn't been a single word from them as to why castration is a humane activity. At best, they have told you that jail can also be a humane. And we tell you that here also there is the same degree of difference, right? fact that these are people who in future may be able to contribute to society, to the benefit of society. We haven't heard a response from them yet on this, right? What we told you is that this possibility of reformation is made impossible when you are taking away a basic function of integration with society. To which the part response we heard from them is the idea that imported people can also contribute. We tell you that sure, we are not saying important people can't contribute to society, but when you take a man who had a certain basic degree and society knew him by that, and then you deprive him of that facility, you are taking away, you're making a drastic change in the way society is functioning. Right? So we tell you that there is indeed a lack of adequate response on the non-delegate. On the idea of wrongful conviction, first of all, we have shown you why it's very likely that in rape trials and rape cases, it's quite likely that conviction happens. But even if it were not likely, we have told you that the mere possibility of wrongful conviction should be enough reason to not go for irrevocable measures, right? We tell you that it's unfair to even the one rapist who might be wrongfully convicted, and they haven't told you why it's fair to put such a huge irrevocable burden on them. And finally, the question of women, right? What works for women? We told you clearly that the reasons that they give for adopting this move tell you that the relationships between men and women can be made normal, can be normalized if you really focus on the sexual effects, focus on the sexual aspects, right? We told you already why that's wrong. And in any case, the problems they identified, right, that women can't integrate back into society, women can't overcome trauma, are not shown to be solved by their model in the first place. They've given us an incomplete case that doesn't fulfill their verdict, and for that reason they lose.
Ladies and gentlemen, when anything has to come up and tell you that status quo is sufficient, what they need to first counter is where there is an additional need or a unique circumstance that imposes an additional duty to go beyond circumstances that currently exist. They haven't done that, and they lose right there. Let's understand why. Because the very beginning of my speech and throughout the three speeches, we explained to you the unique necessity of imposing a new standard in these things. They continued to talk about status quo, where they had an over-exaggerated emphasis on the rights of the victim, while completely ignoring the new additional effects that has started having on not only the victim, but on the larger context of societal discourse on the idea of feminism or the idea of gender disparity. Because they ignored all of these, their arguments are in complete isolation, and we think that's highly problematic. So let's begin with the need itself. We already established to you that deterrence has been failing continuously, and it's not merely because of past subjugation. Because any form of legal sanction, according to their own concession, is supposed to have a deterrent effect. And if it hasn't had it so far, then clearly it's not been working right now. And that's why we told you that we need to go beyond this and evolve a new mechanism to deal with it. We also told you that this requires a distinction of broader lines, just like there have been distinctions based on past cases of societal circumstances. For instance, in cases of untouchability, you don't have to convince a Brahmin to think that the Dalit is as good as he is or as important as he is. You still impose a legal sanction because we believe that the imposition of legal sanction forces you to do things that changes social mindsets. No contest in analysis on that point. Then we told you that the very apprehension for the chilling effect has to be countered by a strong symbolic move, a symbolism that they failed to counter. Because when we tell you that sentencing does not only have the limited role of only contributing to retribution or rehabilitation or things like deterrence, we told you that also has the additional function of utilizing the capacity of sanction to initiate social change, to appease apprehensions that people have of a particular minority or a particular part of society being harmed systematically by a particular kind of crime that we believe can be tackled by these sanctions. No contest on that side. But then we came up and told you that even from the perspective of the victim, the kind of trauma she undergoes and the kind of damage you inflict on her character by raping her once is as irreversible as a sort of subjective humanness that they talked about, without ever explaining to us what are these standards of humanity they're talking about. Why is it so different that castration is more inhuman than life imprisonment? He can come up and tell us intuitive, and that's our problem. Because if it's intuitive, then explain to us independently why that standard of humanity is superior to our standard of humanity. We tell you that talking about inhumanness or humanness of a punishment is irrelevant in this debate. Because we tell you that that is something you cannot measure in terms of the kind of harms it inflicts upon the person being sentenced. But some point of time, we explain to you, this entire idea of humanity evolves. But some point of time, terrorists were considered to be worthy of death sentence because they thought the only way to curb terrorism was killing them. But they did not remove death sentence because it was less, because it was inhuman. They removed it because it just wouldn't work. Instead, they initiated death sentence without parole because that they said was more inhuman, and that they believed would in fact curb terrorism further. That's the kind of sanction that completely failed to address, and they continue to impose this intuitive sense of humanity without ever explaining why we're castrating them and not anything else. Because and this has come out extensively throughout the Latin speeches, right? We told you how emasculation is a superior form of deterrence in cases of rape because the sexual organ itself happens to be an instrument of imposing masculinity. There are strong cultural stereotypes that reinforce this view. We told you that the idea of vengeance is not something which is exclusive to our case because vengeance can arise out of any form of retribution. If you put them behind bars for several years and that hinders their ability to exercise their basic ways of expressing themselves or basic rights like conjugal rights or even the right to meet their family, the right to meet their children, or for that matter just basically socializing in life, these are equally valid basis on which people can be vengeful. It's just because they feel that a woman is got them behind bars is not enough reason for them to be vengeful against women when they come out. So we don't think vengeance can be just suddenly a standard for not imposing a higher standard, right? Lastly, the only thing they came up and kept saying is that we restricted the ability to be productive, like to lift bricks and build railway tracks with their dicks. That's not true. We tell you that productivity can continue to be maintained even after castration because we don't think it's something that's necessarily linked to the act of castration itself. Wrongful conviction is a evasive way of arguing because that exists in all crimes. So we don't think that they deserve to be discriminated.